Good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. On behalf of the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, I'd like to welcome you. I'm Marcia Mintz. I'm Managing Director of the Center. The Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy is an academic research center housed in Georgetown University's McDonough School of Business. The center was established in 2002, and for 15 years, we've worked to encourage thoughtful discussion and to share information among scholars, business leaders, industry experts, and policymakers. We cover a wide range of economic issues at the intersection of business and public policy. We're delighted that you're here to join with us today. Let me now introduce Robert Vastine, Senior Industry and Innovation Fellow at the Center, who will moderate today's discussion on the administration's trade initiatives. Bob?
Well, thank you. Thanks very much, Marcia. Thanks, everybody, for being here. Marcia, is there somebody who could help maybe move this away so that half the people can see us? Thanks. Thank you, Steve. Somebody's here. It is she. She's the managing director, so you know what are we gonna do? Thanks very much for being here. There'll be some other people coming in, and we'll seat them as they arrive. This is a really high moment for us all. We all here have been engaged in trade policy for a long time, and as observers and participants in U.S. and other countries' foreign trade policies. I've been engaged with trade policy since 1966, when I worked for a senior member of the Ways and Means Committee during the Kennedy round negotiations. I do not remember any time in which U.S. trade policy has been so roiled, when the foundations of our policies, legal, institutional, and economic, have been so challenged. So our topic today is cleaning the slate, or starting fresh. The administration has made a number of controversial proposals that are intended to do so, such as renegotiating existing trade agreements, unilaterally imposing new trade barriers on imports from selected countries, enacting new tax policies that would dramatically affect trade, exiting the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, in its way a monumental achievement, suggesting new bilateral agreements with the UK, but also EU members that remain in the EU, thus perhaps spurring destabilization in Europe, and expanding use of remedies against unfair trade, a very important aspect of our trade policy. Today, rather than start with formal opening statements one by one, we thought it might be more productive and fun to pose a few questions that each panelist can respond to as he chooses from his own perspective. So I'm going to read them quickly. As the new administration and its policies take shape, what are your opinions about the direction they're taking? What will U.S. trade policy look like in a year or so? What outcomes might we expect? Can TPP be salvaged by a number of bilateral trade agreements with its remaining participants? Can NAFTA be improved through negotiation? Would it be more useful to focus on issues posed by the major trade and investment challenge, that is China, for example, its overcapacity, et cetera? Have we in fact ceded economic and strategic leadership in the East to China? What are the practical implications of a border tax? If we don't do a border tax, is unilateral action against Mexico and maybe other countries a real possibility? There was a Peterson Institute publication that said that if the one outcome of the Trump policies if fully enacted could be implosion, that is to say that the economy couldn't withstand the disruption. Should our trade enforcement regimes, should Congress take a look and the administration at our trade enforcement regimes, countervailing duties, anti-dumping, be made more robust to make it more possible to return to market opening incentives down the road? We're watching serious strains develop in the EU. What is in fact the impact of Trump's approach to Brexit on the European Union? How could dissolution and weakening of the EU hurt the US? So I'll start with the front question, that is the broad question, and ask each participant to comment briefly, and then we'll move down the list as is appropriate in the discussion. So the new first question is, everybody's got it, as the administration, and I didn't do my intros. So we have as every panel is distinguished, and this panel is particularly distinguished. On my right is Gary Hufbauer, who is at the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and around town, extremely eminent. You have their bios, each person's bio on the paper in front of you. It's a pleasure for me to say that Gary succeeded me as Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Treasury and did a much finer job than I. But we've known each other for that long. That was in the Carter administration. Next is Claude Barfield. Claude and I as well have known each other for a long time. He is at the resident scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, and also very well known around town. Who is next? Terry Stewart is the managing partner of the law offices of Stewart and Stewart. I'm very happy to say that I knew his father when I worked for Congressman Curtis, the Gene Stewart, very eminent outfit. Next is my friend and brilliant friend, Lee-Makiyama, the director of the European Center for International Political Economy in Brussels. I always have to take my time saying that, international political economy. And then finally is Will Marshall, who is president and founder of the Progressive Policy Institute, the PPI, which is very well established here as one of the chief intellectual architects of the movement to modernize progressive politics for the global age. And we need you now, Will. So I'll begin then with Gary with the lead-off question. What are your opinions about the direction things are taking?
Thanks, Bob, and thanks very much for organizing this. Thanks to everyone who's come and everyone who's listening. The first point I would make, and I have 6 quick ones, is that this will be a period of opportunities lost. No TPP, no TTIP, and Bob just told me, no trade and services agreement, no TISA. So none of the 3 Ts. These were birds in the bush, not birds in the hand. They're opportunities lost. We've calculated the benefits that could have been had, but it's not as if you're losing something you already have. It's losing something that you might have had. Second point is that Trump has enormous power, as I've written on our website, to restrict trade. He has much less power to liberalize trade, because to liberalize trade, he has to go back to Congress. But to restrict trade, he has all sorts of unilateral power, lots of statutes going back a century. However, while he's clear with the judiciary in using these powers, in other words, I don't see any court challenges that would be sustained, there are nevertheless checks and balances in the system. The first check is the Congress, which expects to be consulted. The 90-day notice with respect to negotiating NAFTA shows that Trump understands this. And the second check in our system is the financial markets. And I think if Trump were to use these enormous powers that he has to restrict trade in the most draconian ways advertised in the campaign, there would be a financial repercussion that would rattle us all. So, and I think his financial advisors will tell him that. The fourth point I'd make is that there's certain to be lots of trade cases. This is good for Terry Stewart. He's the one practicing lawyer on this panel, and his business will be, his desk will be overflowing with clients and customers and so forth. Lots of trade cases. Individually, these trade cases tend to cover a fairly small amount of trade, so I don't see that as a big macro problem, though it will obviously annoy many countries and many companies. The fifth point is that there's kind of a conflict between Trump's desire to increase jobs, which he wants to do a lot, and to decrease the trade deficit, because the things that he's talked about which will increase jobs in this country are tax reform, infrastructure, and defense spending. All of those will tend to push up the trade deficit. Meanwhile, he's got a notion that you can reduce trade deficits through bilateral agreements. I think that's a fool's errand. But if the jobs come for other reasons, he can say it was because of trade negotiations, and that's probably good enough for politics. So I wrap up that I don't see any big implosion of trade. I just see trade kind of going on like it is, but a lot of sound and light, a real French show. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Claude.
Well, Gary made my my task easier and I could be shorter. I agree with everything he said, except I would be maybe more negative. I really do. You know, there's not much the American Enterprise Institute agreed with President Obama. And I do not speak for the American Enterprise, speak alone. We do not speak as an institute. But certainly in my own case, I think however he started, which was pretty poorly, we remember Mr. Obama ran and won as probably the most protectionist rhetoric we'd had in modern times. But he turned around within 2 years, I think as much because of the diplomatic situation, security situation he faced, particularly in Asia, as the fact that, as has happened with most Democratic presidents in the last, well, all Democratic presidents in the last several decades, his economic advice, whatever the Democratic Party was, and Will Marsh could speak more to this than I, but wherever the Democratic Party was going in relation to trade, the economists who advised Presidents Carter and Clinton and then Obama were, I think, almost uniformly really with a predisposition because of their profession for free trade. And so Obama turned around for both of those reasons. I don't think we're going to see that in this administration. I mean, we have for the first time a Republican president coming in with a group of economic advisors who really are peddling economic nonsense in my view. Peter Navarro is a charlatan as far as I'm concerned. So I have no hope, actually, that anybody around the president, as you found around Obama, will turn him around. So that basically my views are that the direction, Gary went over all the individual things. I'm not going to go over the individual things and can get into details about some losses, individual losses in the sectors in terms of the TPP. But the direction, it seems to me, is an unfortunate and really bad one in terms of the United States, not only our economic near-term and medium-term future, but also our diplomatic and security future. Finally, I would say, and again, we'll come back to this, what's going to be really fascinating to watch, and we're on the Hill, is what are the politics of trade up here? We tend to forget now, after the Sturm and Drang of the 2016 presidential election, that in latest summer of 2015, 190 House Republicans voted for the Trade Promotion Authority. They lost 50. Where does that stand now? It's also true that the Republican base, at least in a number of geographic areas, has moved away from a traditional support of Republican voters for more liberal trade agreements, as it were. It's hard to know how that will play out, because it's also clearly true that whether you're looking at the leadership in the House or the Republican leadership in the House or the Republican leadership in the Senate, I don't think that Paul Ryan has changed his views about trade. So the really interesting political dynamic is how that will really play out, and also it will depend on how radical a change that Mr. Trump and his unfortunate economic advisors try. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you. Gary.
Thanks, Bob. It's a pleasure to be here. Take a slightly different angle on this. My read of the incoming administration is that you have to kind of cut below what the statements are to try to take a look at what the underlying concerns are. There's a significant part of the American public, certainly unions, but lots of NGOs and some industries, who have perceived that trade policy for the last 50 years, whatever its positive advantages, has not focused enough on some of the negative implications. I think that one can look at the Trump agenda, and if you kind of cut it back away from some of the more extreme rhetoric, say that they are looking for a timeout to re-examine whether or not the policy needs to be tweaked. Certainly they are against multilateral deals, which is somewhat interesting, but I think probably flows from their perception that you get more on bilateral deals than you do with a lot of countries at once, whether or not correct. I don't think there's anything wrong with the objective of updating or renegotiating agreements as time passes. NAFTA was done back in the 90s. There's lots of issues that were not covered in NAFTA. And obviously, the Obama administration had used TPP as a way to upgrade the NAFTA vis-a-vis Mexico and Canada. So there are lots of things there that make sense. I agree with Gary that trade is at least a two segments of government issue, and the Congress has their own views on trade. And interestingly, I think that the Republican tax proposal, which is primarily aimed at reducing tax rates for corporations and to some extent for individuals, has within it some opportunities to eliminate some of the more controversial proposals that have come from the president. Many people in the labor movement, and I think many of the people who voted for the new president, perceived that there has been a lost focus on the jobs that are lost from the world's largest trade deficit. We run a trade deficit of $750 billion a year. You can search the Commerce Department records going back, I think, 40 years, and you will never find the U.S. government ever giving a figure for how many jobs get lost from $1 billion of imports, even though USTR and Commerce every year tout how many jobs get created from $1 billion of imports. That would be like announcing Sunday's game and simply saying Atlanta scored 2 touchdowns and hoping that you could figure out whether they won or lost. All right. So I think that there are positive opportunities in the things that the administration presumably has as their core areas of concern, whether or not one agrees with some of the rhetoric as to how they might like to achieve those. So with that, I'll stop up.
Okay, thank you. Hosuk.
Thank you. I've been asked to provide a couple of comments around Europe's reaction to. Sorry about that. It's pushed actually.
Push the button.
So just try to.
You can't help it. He's from Europe. It's It's
Well, actually, it's. Yeah. Okay. Never put a microphone before an Asian guy starts singing karaoke. Anyway. Having said that, yeah, Trump presidency is highly disruptive event for European policy, and there is a reason for that. And actually, I would even argue saying that most of the effect hasn't really sunk in. I'm pretty sure that half of Europe still think this is still a bad dream, and they're going to wake up, and Michelle Obama is president. And but in brief, yeah, actually, that could be. But in short, I think we have to first start by just very briefly examine what's the nature of the partnership with Europe, because it is a very uneasy partnership we've had between the United States and Europe, not least because of the TTIP negotiation. And if you think about EU-US and think, okay, if there are 3 dimensions to a partnership: territory, conflict over territories or alignment over territories, economic, and values. And for United States and Europe in the last, I think, 8 years, it's primarily been about values. Because in terms of economics, we are frenemies, actually even outright enemies. That's friendly competitors, I would say. And in terms of territory, you could argue that if you no longer see Russia as a problem, there is no alliance between Europe and United States. Yeah. And this is the reason why the number one reaction between the EU, from the European leaders, has been primarily about the concern about withdrawing from NATO. It scares the living daylights out of Eastern Europe, because this is the security guarantee. And this is also the guarantee that the European leaders cannot provide to themselves. It's basically the branch that we sit on. So this is yet to sink in, and it's a very different reaction from, let's say, China or even Japan, where they would actually welcome a little bit of security autonomy, whereas Europe actually want the opposite. United States must remain in Europe, otherwise we can't fund our, welfare programs, because then we have to spend our money on defense. And this is really contrary to our interest. And also, another thing I would say in terms of trade, moving to that topic, is that even though it hasn't sunk in, we have to bear in mind that the entire trade paradigm not only the US relationship, was based on TTIP. Everything was defined by TTIP. At the end of TTIP, you could even argue and say that there is no European trade diplomacy. It's still looking for a narrative beyond beyond TTIP. And also, it was very much defined by the competition against TPP. And even though TPP may be withdrawn, we don't exactly know yet in what form. And also, we have the question about whether the US-Japan bilateral may take place. It is very, very clear. I don't think I'm spilling any beans by saying that in all our negotiations with the Asian Pacific countries, we've been put to a halt simply because everybody is waiting for the Trump administration to react. And this calls for actually a couple of conclusions. One, Europe is not ready to lead because people won't let Europe lead. And there's, of course, a number of reasons for that. We work from a template. We reluctantly abide by free trade, and we have very difficult to move from the template because our internal complex model. And also, we are very unaccustomed to this transactional economic diplomacy that Trump will be setting up. It's almost like a romantic, ideal-based, value-based power who's going to struggle in a very cold, realist world. And you can almost immediately see how this had an impact on the European, reaction on Trump presidency in terms of trade policy, but also migration and other issues. We brace for the worst. And in a sense, you could even say that we are starting to react to United States trade policy a little bit like North Korea. It's perfectly rational to be irrational. And we as a power cannot deal with that kind of transactional policy because we will be asked to do things that we are not prepared to do and we don't have the powers to do. And this basically, I think, leads to the last concern, which we have seen now in the press, is that the Trump administration is now offering free trade negotiation with individual EU member states. That's legally, technically, and also politically impossible. It's based on assumption that Europe, it's better to divide and conquer, and it's actually better that the EU didn't exist. But it's also based on a gross miscalculation to think that European Commission, Brussels, is Europe. It is not. What's happened in the latest years during the crisis is that all the powers have gone back to the member states. And that means basically that Europe is still actually united, but between the member states. Divide and conquer with China and Russia, it will not work. Brexit is an anomaly. I'm happy to talk more about that, but I think my time is up.
Extremely provocative, and thank you very much. I'm glad Husuk happened to be in New York and contacted me, and I said, get down here. And he did. He took the Acela and he got down here, so we're very glad to have that perspective. Before we go next to Will, could I ask someone to close the doors because it's a little distracting? Those doors there. Okay, going now to Will.
Well, thanks, Bob and Marsha. It's great to be here with the Georgetown Center again. Sorry. I want to step back a little. I'm not we have some of the titans of trade policy across the transatlantic world here at this table. I'm not a trade economist, even though PPI has advocated for trade policies for a long time. But I want to put Donald Trump's approach to trade in context. In his inaugural speech, I learned something, which was that it fits into a worldview. And his worldview can be described as a coherent worldview. I don't agree with it, but it's coherent as arch economic nationalism. And it really is a challenge. It's really a torpedo amidships to 70 years of American internationalism predicated on trade liberalization, international economic cooperation as a pillar of American security and economic interests in the world, a part of our leadership strategy. That's now being directly challenged by President Trump and Mr. Bannon in favor of this America First idea, which, by the way, used to be, until recently, until Trump resurrected it, was a discredited idea in American history. This was associated with arch isolationists and German sympathizers like Charles Lindbergh right out there on the eve of World War II. and it had a bad aura around it until, well, Pat Buchanan first tried to resurrect it, didn't work. Now Mr. Trump has done that. So what is being proposed here is not just radical changes in trade policy, it's radical changes in America's orientation to the world, our leadership role over 7 decades since Franklin Roosevelt. So this is huge. Now, I'm not opposed to radical change necessarily if it's based on sound empirical diagnosis of what's wrong with our economy. This isn't. It's based on a misdiagnosis of the impact of trade and what is the central economic challenge facing our country. It's also based on a canard of that Mr. Trump uses all the time, that there's been a bipartisan conspiracy, basically, to negotiate bad trade agreements. We've had nothing but incompetent trade negotiators on both sides, Republican and Democratic, who have been dedicated to selling out American workers. This sounds like a crazy conspiracy theory, but this is what I hear our president now saying. And the third reason that this radical change doesn't make a lot of sense to me is it isn't grounded in widespread popular support. So I think the first point is that all of us who care about these issues have to defend objective reality against the assault that it's under. Trade has not, in fact, destroyed millions of manufacturing jobs. This comes straight out of the realm of alternative facts. And, we have to say that over and over again. Brad DeLong has got a great analysis out that shows by his lights that since 1950, only 5% or less of manufacturing job losses in the United States reflect the big trade agreements that Mr. Trump complains about or China's entry into the WTO. Nonetheless, there is acute economic distress in the country, as Terry pointed out. That's driving this change. It's just, again, the distress is real, but it is not really because of trade. It has more to do with technological change, with the broad structural transformation of the American economy. And it's much easier, though, instead of talking about these forces, it's much easier to scapegoat foreign trade and immigrants coming into the country. But I do think it's important to go to the heart of the problem, which is there are many ways to think about the inequality in the United States, many ways to capture it. But I'll just talk about this great divergence, that's basically demarcated by educational attainment. Americans with college degrees now account for 50% of household income. That's up from 37% in 1991. Those with just a high school degree or less account for only 5% of national income, down from 12%. So the rise of the knowledge economy has been a calamity for people who work with their hands. This transformation away from a manufacturing and industrial economy to a post-industrial or knowledge economy is as seismically traumatic to lots of Americans as the shift from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy over a century ago. That shift triggered the first populist revolt in American history, and this shift is triggering a second populist revolt, not only in the United States, but all across Europe. In both cases, elites and people in government have done a lousy job of helping the people most hit hardest by this transition find a new role in a changing economy, and that is the root of the problems. But now we're offering folks this cruel hoax that somehow we're going to bring back the old economy when the real discourse ought to be about how to create a new middle class, a new social compact for the knowledge economy. I want to talk a little more later about the changing political landscape here and about how we need to change the way we talk about trade. I don't think the classic free trade arguments are going to get traction for the next couple of years in the United States. And I think we need to, stand our ground on trade and globalization. But we do need to change our language. We'll have more to say about that.
Well, that's pretty profound. I hesitate to turn the conversation to quote details like the future of NAFTA or our relationships with China. This is so global in a sense, so overwhelming that we could stick with the overall big picture. But maybe I should ask the panelists if anyone wants to respond to anything anybody else has said, and then move on. Any comment? Okay. I'm going to change the pattern here and ask the audience now if they've got any questions about any aspect of this, and then we can go to more detail. So, yes, ma'am. Please identify yourself.
My name is Colleen with the House.
Oh, yeah, here it comes.
Colleen Lickenhouse, graduate from MSB. Thank you very much. I guess my question is more about the our elected officials, particularly those in Congress. You know, 100 years ago, the Republicans had the North, the Democrats had the South. The Republicans were more anti-trade, the Democrats were more pro-trade. You referenced the votes of losing 50 Republicans. I'm sort of curious about the Democrats. We only had 28 Democrats that voted for it, although the Democratic Party across the country is increasingly pro-trade. The millennials are pro-trade, immigrants, Latinos. So I'm just wondering if you think there's a shift, and that if the Democrats on the Hill will reflect the Democrats across the country that are increasingly pro-trade, or if you see some sort of shift like that.
Well, let's see.
Go ahead, Gary.
Okay, Will, then Claude, then.
Well, it's a great question, and one point I want to make it at the outset is that Donald Trump talked a lot about the people and what they're demanding in his inaugural address. It's kind of scary to me, but he only talked about some people. The people who are really now who've turned hard against trade are the white working class voters who have not benefited from the political economy of the last 20 or plus years. But when you look at what's happening across the country, the picture's not so bad. But what has changed is the Republican Party. I was just showing Hosek some really shocking numbers. I mean, and it all happened during this last campaign. And basically, you've got the divide is between elites and rank and file in both parties. The elites of the Democratic Party are against trade, strongly influenced by labor and other interest groups. But rank and file Democrats are solid majorities, continue to say that on balance they think trade and trade agreements are a good thing for the country, necessary and a good thing, even though they do worry about the job impacts. And Hillary's voters were more pro-trade than anybody else's in the campaign. And the opposites happened on the Republican side, where now you have the elites of the Republican Party, the establishment, has been strongly pro-trade. Now the base has turned against that. So I don't, I'm supposed to talk about Democrats, but I want to say that I'm not sure we can look to the Republican Party anytime soon to put an effective check on Mr. Trump's ideas on trade, because those members of the Republican caucus in House and Senate are looking over their shoulders at strongly pro-Trump core voters. There's an opportunity for Democrats to make headway because Mr. Trump is so strongly anti-trade, and I already see some of my liberal friends rediscovering the arguments in favor of trade and global integration now that used to be on the other side of the debate. But I don't want to exaggerate that. As long as the interest groups that are so dominant in Washington call the tune, it's going to be hard to scare up votes for trade agreements. Not that it's going to be a big issue, because we're not going to probably have any opportunity for those kind of votes.
Yeah, I agree with Will and defer to him on talking about Democratic voters, but I do think that the last point he made is key. There's been no, at least as far as I can see, and you may know more in terms of debate in Democratic circles than I do, certainly, but I can't see that there's been any movement of the House Democrat, that's where we're really talking, I think that's key in terms of trade, away from a fairly rigid position against new free trade agreements. They are still tied very much to labor, environmental groups, public citizen and NATO right groups, and I don't see much change in that. On the Republican side, I come back to the fact I agree that it's probably going to be tough, because I think House Republicans and even the senators, except for Graham and McCain, are scared to death of tweets, and so they don't want to get tweeted. So it's hard to know how the Republicans, your typical Republican member, will react. But I still think that if you look at the rhetoric now still of the Republican leadership, and look at beyond trade, you cannot go along with some of the nonsense that Trump and his people are putting out and have traditional Republican values about pro-market, pro-competition, and less government. And so there's a clash there, and I don't know how that will. I actually don't know how that will work out. Gary, you.
Okay, Claude. Gary, I'm sorry. Gary.
Thanks. I just want to, while agreeing with everything that's been said, put a small historical perspective on this. If you go back to the years of the 19th century and the early 20th century, trade was a really big issue in the U.S. And we had these periodic tariff bills, which would be more protectionist or less protectionist under Wilson, more protectionist under the three Republican presidents in the 1920s. That's Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover, all quite protectionist. And you know, that was a central debate. Now, then after the Second World War, the strength of opinion on trade as a political issue, it dropped way down. I mean, on the polls, up until this election, this presidential election, it was like a number 8 or 9 out of 8 or 9 issues. Mm-hmm. Now, what Trump has done is elevated this back to the position, that is trade debate, to the position it had been in the 1920s and earlier. And that's really very interesting. Maybe it will return to where it was, but certainly not as long as Trump is in office. And the other, I'd say, anomalous thing about this whole relationship is that back in the 20s, trade, imports, exports, goods and services, percent of GDP, it was about 8%, 8 or 9%. Now those figures are about 25%. So you might say objectively there's more reason for trade to be important. But the reason trade is important to Trump and his team is the deficit, the $500 billion deficit. That is only 2.5% of GDP. So if that 2.5% somehow goes away through some combination of policies, you know, kind of what happens to the issue.
Cool. Anybody else in the audience want to comment now? Someone in the back? There are two. Go ahead. First you and then you. Okay. Reverse it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Trump got elected.
Sorry, will you say your name, please?
Sorry, Rafi Goodstein with the American Iron and Steel Institute. Trump got elected in large part because he was able to flip Midwestern states that traditionally go for the Democrats and make them vote for Republicans. So, you know, Pennsylvania, Michigan, et cetera. And I think a big piece of that messaging there was, you know, saying TPP is a rape of the country, NAFTA is a disaster, et cetera, et cetera. And by winning, do you think that future Republicans will follow that? I know we've been talking about Trump specifically, but do you think that other Republicans will say, hey, maybe the way to win the Midwest, states that historically have gone for the Democrats, is to give up on trade, walk away from it, and that opens the door to getting to 270?
Who would like to pick that up? Will.
It's going to be a great temptation. You know, Claude said that Republicans are worried about tweets, and I'm sure they are. We all are. Nobody wants to get hit by one. But
Well, if it's a presidential one, you sure don't.
right. But what? It's a badge of honor. Yeah. Right. Yeah, it's like the enemies list. Yeah. But I just want to make this point. You know. What really moves members' behavior, motivates members' behavior is less tweets, it's primary challenges. And the polarization of American politics is such that the most likely way anybody, Democrat or Republican, is going to lose their seat is not in a partisan battle, it's being primaried in their own party. And right now, 87% of Republicans who have districts carried by Donald Trump strongly approve Donald Trump. So I'm really worried that the likely way out of this box or this dilemma is that we are going to have bad policies. We're going to have protectionist policies. We're going to go back and we'll explode our relationship with Mexico, possibly over this renegotiation of NAFTA. Could be in a trade war with China very soon, which would even have a much bigger impact on our economy. And we may have to relearn what we thought we knew about protectionism and mercantilism and economic nationalism before we can change the political dynamic that's happening in the country.
Well, I guess I would comment perhaps on the earlier question. I think that the reason labor has been actively opposed to trade agreements and trade policy is that the concerns that they've had have simply not been addressed. I think in the context of the way USTR historically has operated, they have typically looked to the interest of the companies for whom they're out negotiating, which makes perfect sense. But companies now are obviously much more multinational than they were 50 years ago. And so oftentimes the sole standing party with an interest in what happens in America is not the company, but rather the workers or the state or the local community. And I know in TPP, the reason that there was such strong opposition was, in fact, on an issue that dealt with rules of origin in the auto sector, where the auto companies had a view that was understandable from their global footprint, and the unions had a view that was understandable from the point of view of trying to keep jobs in America. And their view was ignored, and the view of the companies was adopted. And so as long as you have a situation where the workers feel that their views are not incorporated in trade policy, then I think the Democrats will continue to have problems getting their members to come out in support of liberalization.
I would only point out, though, that this was an administration that was the Obama administration was an administration that was highly pro-labor. And it certainly took into account, whether you could take the rules of origin on other things, in advancing the labor enforcement provisions of the TPP, which could come close, I think, to pushing Republicans away from it. But this is as pro-labor an administration as you're likely to get in trade policy or any other policy. So it wasn't they were ignored.
There is a point of view, I'll come back to the gentleman in the back in a minute, expressed by Ed Alden, a very distinguished writer, columnist now with the Council on Foreign Relations, who's published recently a book, and I regret that I can't think of the title. But the thesis is that this crisis has been building for decades. In fact, he cites Burke-Hartke, a movement, a bill that would have been draconian in all its aspects. It was in the 60s, introduced in the 60s. It was a very, or maybe early 70s. It was a very serious attack on the order that we know, on the trade liberalization movement and on legislation. So Ed's point is that we've ignored this building catharsis, this popular dissent at our own peril, and now it is on us. It is descended upon us, and he looks. You look for why that was. Is it the fault of the business community for not being more aggressive about funding, helping fund trade adjustment assistance? Has it been which in fact is underfunded and has been underlooked or overlooked rather. It is quite a serious charge, I think, and I don't know. I'm wondering if I could ask my colleagues whether they have an opinion on that point of view of Ed's.
I have to leap in on this one. Yeah, it's been neglected politically. It was not neglected in the academic pro-trade community. Never has been. We wrote a lot about it in our institute. I'm sure that Brookings did. I'm sure that AEI did. Virtually all institutes would have written on this issue of the dislocated American worker. Here's the core issue. A very small percentage, as Will gave a figure, I would say it's a little higher than what he gave, but in any event, a very small percentage of workers are dislocated because of trade. A very large percentage, in say dislocation is about 4 million workers a year. A very large percentage because of automation, like 80 or 85 or 90%. Now, the problem with trade adjustment assistance and such programs as we have, which are the least generous and the most stingy of any advanced country, is that they've been narrowly targeted in their own special stinginess on workers who are impacted by trade and can come up with some petition, which is about 70,000 workers a year at current times. So all these millions of workers who get really very little out of the government system, naturally they feel neglected, and then a politician like Trump comes along, or Sanders, said basically the same thing, and blame it all on trade, and create this irrational hatred. But the core issue goes right back to, I worked for Secretary Schultz way back. very brilliant person and a great statesman, but he came to the issue. It's just too expensive, he said at the time. I think he was wrong, but just too expensive to have a program that covers all the dislocated workers on anything like the scale that any other advanced country does. And that would be Canada, starting with Canada. That would be the UK, that would be France, that would be Netherlands, et cetera, et cetera. Well, I think that was a mistake, but we had a buoyant economy, so you could kind of go with it. And there it is. I mean, you got to talk about multiple billions of dollars to deal with all these dislocated people. And until you do that, you're going to have this golden opportunity for populist politicians. We shall see if Congress rises to the problem of the moment.
Hosek, did you want to comment?
Yeah, just very briefly. I looked, as well as Gary, on the what actually dislocated the U.S. manufacturing. And the thing is, well, if it's not China, then it must be automation. The truth is, it's not automation either. I mean, if you look at the factory productivity increase, I speak like an economist because I am one, but if you look at the productivity increases that you've seen in the United States, as well as many OECD countries in the last, let's say, 10 years of automation, digitalization, it's puny compared to the PC revolution. It's actually nothing compared to if you look at the manufacturing revolution that took place when real heavy machinery replaced workers. So if you start to plot trade, and especially China versus manufacturing jobs, actually the effect is the reverse than you expect. It's actually the other way around. The Chinese demand American goods. They need it in order to grow their economy. And if you look at Google's shares versus unemployment in the United States, you'll see the reverse relation as well. The main job killing manufacturing is actually services. Most jobs were never lost. They were just upgraded to services jobs. You can think about it. I mean, look at your, the previous generation. You were maybe working on the factory floor, but suddenly you were actually an assistant service manager or a client director. And that's actually most of how manufacturing jobs were lost in the United States and Europe. They were never really lost. And I think that's a very important point to remember. And that goes also to the first question we were hearing about the narrative around trade. So with the record low unemployment that we see now in most of Western Europe, as well as United States, in a historical context, it's relatively low. Why is this an issue now? I think it's a narrative problem. And I think as Will was pointing out, it's a question about communication. It's a question about tweets. And one thing that I would say, which is quite unique with the debate that we have now here in the United States, because this debate around trade and inequality happens globally. But there's one thing that's unique with the debate here in the United States, is that it assumes actually that the income inequality is constant. In the rest of the world, we are talking about a dynamic economy vis-a-vis others. How are we going to get ahead? And some people say, we'll never will. But it's only in the United States where you can say, we don't want to have income increases like TPP because we can't redistribute them fairly. It's like saying, okay, we cannot have any kind of income increase because it will not be distributed fairly to the manufacturing and also the discounted middle class and working class. It's kind of almost like a lost cause. And that, I think, was a surprising element, if you see comparatively from the other countries' point of view, is that the inauguration speech of Donald Trump was, for us, Marxist. If you replace the American worker with proletariat, you have a template for a socialist and extreme left speech in China as well as Europe. So, yeah, it's only in those corners you will find that narrative. So that's the main difference, I think.
Terry, not surprisingly, this causes contest. Go ahead.
Well, one of the reasons I think that NAFTA has been in the eye of a lot of the people who have supported Trump is an issue that most economists don't either recognize or acknowledge, and that is that however many jobs have been lost to Mexico, you would be hard-pressed to find a manufacturing job that hasn't been threatened to be moved to Mexico for purposes of keeping wages down, all right, or to Mexico or China or to other countries. I used to be in business before I became a lawyer, and I can tell you it happened all the time. And the tipping point that happened in this election was basically that you've had 40 years of basically flat income for working men and women in the country, and there are lots of pictures that say this is trade. Whether or not economists can agree that it's that trade costs the jobs, it certainly costs the wages, or the ability to move jobs, or the ability to threaten to move jobs, cost the wages to a lot of people, and that is a factor that isn't done. I agree with Gary that we have done a very poor job as a country in terms of having a social safety net and education system to help people move on if they lose their jobs for whatever reason.
So it sounds like I'll go back to you, just to be fair, in the back there.
Hi, Nick Furter. I'm from Washington State. We're very trade dependent. We also have unique views. Can you hear me?
No, you have to hold it up here.
We also have unique views on trade. I think WTO had a unique welcome there, but we're also one of the most trade dependent states in the union. We also benefit from the Export-Import Bank quite a bit, not just from Boeing, but also from suppliers further down on the supply chain. And so I'm curious, and I hear a lot of resignation and some doom and gloom in what you're saying right now. And so for the benefit of the greatest state
You're very
in the
perceptive.
Union, for the benefit of the greatest state in the union, what can we do? What can we do to advocate, not just react to some of these policies that we don't know yet? I'm thinking particularly Ex-Im Bank. That's kind of been on the chopping block for a little while now. How do we make sure that that doesn't suffer, like TTIP and all the other things that we liked?
Well, that's I get too lost in the Ex-Im Bank issue. That's fairly, I mean, I understand that it's important to you, but it's pretty marginal in terms of the things that have been discussed here. I mean, if we had the best training and worker adjustment programs, Terry, in the world, would we still have been able to withstand the lure of cheap labor from Mexico? I mean, I began work at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce decades ago, in the 60s, and then we were beginning to deal with the maquiladores problem. Pardon me? Yeah. And the Chamber's position was, well, look, it's trade. You know, it's the operation of the free market, and so they are over there, and they're paying people $1 an hour or whatever it is, and we can't stand in the way of that because that's the way business is conducted, and it makes sense because we can make cheaper products to supply the American market, et cetera. We're all familiar with that, but is that part of the Ed Alden problem? Is that part of was that the wrong policy? Should we have allowed those manufacturing facilities to be established in that way? Was that a way to maintain American jobs? Or does it come down to Secretary Schultz's bad decision or inappropriate decision, or the position of the business leadership, which I understand has not wanted to, like Schultz, not wanted to appropriate the money necessary for a really comprehensive, serious trade adjustment assistant worker dislocation program. You know, it would cost billions of dollars. But when I talk to, just to go on for half a second longer, when I talk to the representatives here in Washington, the senior representatives of GE and IBM and others, they say, and ask about this issue, their response, all of them, is to say what they do, what IBM does, what GE does to retrain. We spend more money on that than, you know, and then they'll cite the figure. And they do. They do spend a huge amount of money training and retraining workers, new ones and existing ones, for jobs that they need. And I can certainly understand that. But that's not a response to the national issue. So I think we really haven't, and I don't hear anything in the Trump policies that says to the Labor Department, okay, we want to gas up your programs. We have had on this panel the woman, very able Assistant Secretary, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Trade Adjustment Assistance from Labor Department. They are very serious folks. They had 49,000 cases last year of individuals, 49,000 individuals that they were able to supply help to. But as Gary says, that's a drop in the bucket. They're earnest, serious people, but that's not going to do it. So I'm wondering whether there's, I don't know what the question is here. Do we have to face the implosion? Will suggested it's not the same kind of implosion maybe, but do we have to face the catastrophe that this is all going to redound to the huge disadvantage of the American worker and consumer, and we just have to learn the bitter lesson like we learned it in the 30s? Is it down to that? I don't know if anybody has any response to that.
I'm going to turn to Gary, but you wandered on so much you lost it. What's the we we're talking about, or what is it? What is the proposition? I think the point of the implosion was if we get in a trade war, as I understand it. Right. So if that's one thing, but you were then talking about the more general question of the effects of trade on income inequality and wages. We ought to separate those.
Okay, that's
I
where
think
I
the
went.
first one, and I could pick up after you, but go ahead. I just want to be. We kind of wandered in all kinds of
We
directions.
did. I'm sorry. That's my fault.
ahead.
Well, I like the wandering, but just to come back
Thank
to the
you.
question, let me say a word for the Ex-Im Bank. I've been associated with that for years, and it's just absolutely ridiculous that we phased it out. I agree with Bob that it's marginal, but it's an important margin, and every other advanced country has a much larger bank than we have, and now our bank is basically out of business. It's as simple as that. So if you're pro-export, which this administration is, you should tell Jeff Sessions, because he's in your administration, to get with the Ex-Im Bank. He opposed it in the Senate. So, and Henserling as well. So maybe we could do something about that, but I agree it's marginal. The big thing is the exchange rate. We've had an overvalued exchange rate, the US dollar, for 20 years or more. And that is the biggest single reason that's within our control to why we have this continuing deficit, which is now about $500 billion, which has led to all this political upheaval. And, who controls the exchange rate? Well, this didn't even get mentioned in the campaign. There are two bodies which control it: the Federal Reserve, and actually the exchange rate is in the Humphrey-Hawkins bill. Nobody notices it, but it's there, and the Treasury. Those two agencies together have everything to say about the exchange rate, and they've not said a whit about it under the Obama administration, under the George W. Bush, under the Clinton. Just let it go. So high exchange rate for a lot of reasons, and we get these persistent trade deficits, which is quite unfortunate. Maybe just to put a final number and a code on what Bob said, the actual expenditure on trade adjustment assistance, this tiny little program, is less than $500 million. Right. I mean, this is ridiculous.
Well said.
Yeah, on the Ex-Im, very, very briefly on the Ex-Im. I think Ex-Im is probably the mercantilist measure that most people in the WTO system can tolerate. It's one of those sort of permitted things. There's one complication. One is that actually Washington State actually went after the European Ex-Im, the European Investment Bank, over Boeing and Airbus, right? That's number one. Let me show you a glass house. Yeah, I know. It's and the number two is the Europe. Europe and United States together went after Sinosure and CDB. We never raised a case in the WTO, but it is one of the major irritants of the international trading system of export credit. So I'm not advocating. I'm not a big fan of political loans in Europe. I mean, I think everyone in this panel will vouch for that. That I'm not very European, but overall, I think that's a double-edged sword that we would need to think about what kind of a political implication that would have. That's all.
Okay, I think Will is next, and then Claude.
So I said earlier that I think we need to change the language that we talk about these policies. And And I think trade adjustment is something we ought to throw in the trash can for a while. Because it's just marginal. Nobody cares about it. It's not big. It doesn't move the dial at all. And both Terry and Gary are both right that we have both parties have unconscionably ignored the impact since 2000 on working class and frankly white working class people of structural economic transformation. I don't think they've been dissenting against trade policy. They've been feeling the results of policies since 2000 that have done nothing but bring them downward mobility, stagnant wages, and the sense of being culturally engulfed or displaced. So, they've totally withdrawn confidence in government policies on trade, but also on trade adjustment. They don't believe in any of that. We need a 10 times bigger offer than that. It's got to be a new social contract where we actually steer dollars to the stricken areas in the United States. And we know where they are. They're places where people came out and voted, where Trump overperformed with white voters in rural areas and small town areas. Where the economy was doing worst, Trump did best. And Hillary Clinton swept the big cities where the new economy is doing pretty well. So, we know the geography of distress here. And we know the demography of distress here, and we need large-scale policy interventions to steer economic development dollars, human capital development dollars. We are even thinking about community stabilization funds that actually help preserve existing production capacity to at least slow down the erosion of the production capacity that these communities have as they make adjustments. So, we need to go a lot farther than trade adjustment to thinking about large-scale interventions that really do rise to the level of a social contract that's going to ensure that people with lower levels of education can still get middle-income jobs and not have this perennial fear of not getting into or falling out of the middle class.
Claude wanted to comment.
I actually like to shift, look at some of the other
Good.
questions that we
Okay.
haven't gotten to, and let me start off, and the other guys can chip in here, and that is sort of looking at what's this administration going to be doing in the next few months in terms of trade, and then you asked a question about a year from now. One of the things that I must say did surprise me, I knew that they were going to change things in trade, but I sort of thought that in trade, and as opposed to some other areas, they might move more slowly. They are really right out of the box, ready to go with a lot of things, and we can all have our opinions about where exactly they're going to go. But I think it's probably not surprising because, in a sense, a lot of the things that Trump as president is dealing with, he doesn't know a lot about and has had no background in, whether dealing with Iran or Iraq or other things. In trade, he has a record of 20 years, and if you substitute China for Japan, or China for Japan, which he was talking about in the 1980s, you can see he's been saying the same thing since the 1980s. So he's ready to go. Now, it looks as if, for instance, they are, as a lot of you probably already know, they have already notified either formally or formally Canada and Mexico. Mexico and Canada are already preparing for negotiations. They've already gone out of the TPP, and they're thinking about the. Well, before I get to TPP, I should say that we've heard this week that within the White House, they are looking at all of the free trade agreements that the United States has, so that they have at least farther out the idea that you need to upgrade, in their view, any of the trade agreements that are already on the table. So this is already working. And I should say that we forget that most of the Trump people are not in place yet, but with the Secretary of Commerce and Mr. Navarro in the White House, they can move forward, and they can use the Commerce and the USTR staff really to do this. So you've got that. One other couple of points about the TPP. There's a question here about whether you could replace the TPP. You cannot replace the TPP with bilaterals. You can certainly go back and build up. And here's a guy who has talked about the art of the deal, and he inherited a deal, which was, I think, a very good deal, with some 11 other countries, and they've scrapped it. So now they have to go back and slog through, if they want to do this or want to rebuild it, individual bilaterals. From an economist's point of view, I should point out that the bilateral agreements, while they're sometimes necessary if you can't get beyond that, are really the worst, sort of a second or third best, because what you're doing is dividing up markets. We had this debate in the 1990s about the spaghetti bowl. You had everybody who's doing bilaterals. Well, that's great for the two countries, but it's not so great for the countries on the outside, and also for the system because you're getting all kinds of rules. So this is a retrograde, I think a retrograde step. I think I had hoped and wrote about this a month ago that the TPP countries outside the non-EU U.S. TPP countries would see the benefits of just going on and putting together a TPP without the United States. They couldn't do it under the terms of the TPP. But the reason I argued this was that if you're Japan or Malaysia or Australia, whichever country, you've already taken the political heat for whatever you gave up, whatever sensitive issue you had in the TPP. And you've got the potential benefits are there too. Again, a country like Vietnam, which took a lot of flack for some of the things it did internally, I think, even though it's an authoritarian society. It made sense to do it. I doubt if that's going to happen. You've had Australia and Chile and I think New Zealand talk about why don't we do this. I think the key is going to be Japan. And the pressure on Japan is going to go in the other direction, I think, because the administration has already signaled that it wants to begin talking with Japan about a bilateral agreement. So let me just kick that off as to what I think where they're going to be. They will move forward, and I haven't mentioned, and they talk always about they want something positive. And the thing that's dropped in their lap, which is not very important economically, marginally important economically, is the United Kingdom. But even there, as you may have said, and certainly would say, it's going to be 2 years before, at least, before the UK is ready to really sign anything. I suppose there's nothing to stop them from talking to the United States. So let me leave it there and just kick it over to others about what's actually going to happen.
Okay, what is going to happen? Do you want to, Jose?
Well, to follow up on the point on Japan, I would say I agree with you fully on every point. To be a little bit of devil's advocate, I would say also like this, that if your primary interest of TPP was, let's say, not corner China, not to build an Asia-Pacific alliance, not to build a trilateral to get rid of rules of origin, but actually to disguise a US-Japan FTA behind the back door. And obviously there were some voices. I mean, there are conspiracy theories and there are alternative theories and alternative facts. But regardless of what you think, I mean, if you think that there is an merit in trying to open up Japan in whatever means possible, it's inevitable that United States doesn't need Canada, Mexico, and Australia by its side to open up Japan. You can do it bilaterally. You might even run into the risk of diluting your offensive interests because Canada and Australia's export interest vis-a-vis Japan is going to be very different from United States. This is also something we see now when Europe, try to negotiate with Japan, that basically we have zero overlap in terms of offensive interests. So TPP doesn't help us. And there were certainly voices in the Republican Party who were not necessarily opposing TPP, but saying we should do a bilateral with Japan first we move into a TPP. That is, I think, very important. I have two further questions. One is in terms of the trade agenda is, of course, if you drum up so much leverage against China now, as the Trump administration seemed to do, if you follow the template of what happened during the 80s with Japan, was that we landed into a grand bargaining. It wasn't a free trade agreement, but there was a number of exchange of bilateral letters that eventually also led to the VERs, etc. So the question, are we heading towards a grand bargain against China? You could almost call it, probably you could say that the only president that would have the credibility to do a trade deal with China would be Trump. I don't think any other president would get away with it. The second question is the TTIP question. And the problem here is that we are running against the clock. If we are not doing TTIP or trying to look into the Europe problem again, Europe will probably strike an alliance with China. Not today, not within 3 years, but it's an inevitable question because Europe and United States have run out of major trading partners that could impact their GDPs. So it's just a simple fact.
Wow. Okay, I think Terry had his hand up first. And
Yeah, offensively, I think Japan is an interesting upside. The real question, I guess, is how much of the innovations from TPP get incorporated in a bilateral there. NAFTA, I think, will be more difficult simply because of the atmospherics around it. And on China, if you take a look at the 2006 USTR report on WTO compliance, there's something like 35 or 40 major areas of problem with China. And in my view, what that really says is we've lost the ability that we had before the Uruguay round to do the kind of big bilateral deal because VERs, VRAs are supposedly off the table if we're going to be compliant with the WTO, which obviously is a major problem. But I think that if one is going to have a positive relationship with China that actually addresses what the underlying concern is, all of the barriers that continue to make it a 3-to-1 or 4-to-1 trade relationship between us and them, that it really requires you to kind of step away from the traditional model and see what else can you do, whether that be a managed trade situation, which obviously is not desirable, but maybe the one that would create the least friction in terms of the relationship with them.
Gary.
Coming back to Japan, as Hosik raised, Senator Hatch has been very keen on a U.S.-Japan bilateral, and he's a very powerful voice in the country and in the Congress. However, there are a couple of difficulties I would emphasize. One, in a bilateral, the U.S. would want more than was negotiated in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And what does more mean? It means substantially more reduction of barriers on agriculture, which is very politically difficult in Japan, and substantially greater opening of the services, which the services sector in Japan, as Bob well knows, having worked that vineyard for many years, is quite restricted. So that's what the U.S. would want, but what would the U.S. give? How could the U.S. under Trump give greater access in the auto market than what it already gave in TPP, or greater access in any other manufactured area? I mean, it's just a complete contradiction in terms of the standard negotiation where you both give and get in mercantilist terms, approximately on even amounts, and that would not be the terms of the kind of negotiation which President Trump seems to be aiming for in bilaterals. So I don't see that kind of a marriage made in heaven. What I can see is some kind of very, one of these economic partnership agreements which has very little economic substance, but is basically a cover for the military alliance, which is quite important for Japan, and that might be the outcome. A brief word on China. I mean, the Osik's suggestion of a kind of a Nixon to China, Trump to China, that is provocative. That does open the mind, for sure. but Terry has again come to the reality, which is that China in the last couple of years has become very much more restrictive than it was before. Not that it was completely open before, but it's become more restrictive, and that seems to fit with the internal Chinese dynamic. So maybe going on to one of your other questions, Bob, the notion that China would take leadership, well, through infrastructure spending, they might take leadership in parts of Asia, but leadership, the way the U.S. played it in the post-war period, which was to open our market very generously to other countries, that doesn't seem to be in the Chinese spirit at the moment. And so I'm pretty skeptical of substantive trade leadership, though given the rhetoric and so forth, they could take a kind of a nominal trade leadership.
In the last 10 minutes here, this is risky. Let's talk briefly, if we can, about the border tax. And from the standpoint of maybe NAFTA and Mexico and the wall. What do you think is going to happen? Can the border? I'm going to address this to Gary because he spent a lot of time on it. Do we need the border adjustment tax?
I'll try to be brief, but this could be a couple of hours, so we've got a couple of days. The most important thing about tax reform, I mean, this is the first time in 30 years that the Congress has had the political stars with the White House to do business tax reform. So I surely hope that the opportunity is not lost. The two most important things on tax reform in the business field are to get the corporate rate down so we're on par and hopefully more competitive than all our trading partners and all the rest of the world. And secondly, to adopt a territorial system which has now become the norm in the world. And we are the outliers. The business-unfriendly outliers, those are the two most important issues. The U.S. has all sorts of wonderful features and advantages, but taxes are not one of them. It's one of the negative features. That's the inversion, that's the transfer pricing abuse, and you know, all this kind of other stuff is a straight payment for our terrible corporate tax system. So those are the two important features. Now, the border tax adjustment is what the leaders in the House came up with as a way to kind of square the circle as the linchpin to get these other two things. And you know, maybe it is the linchpin, maybe it isn't. There's a big coalition against it. What I would urge the House advocates of this to do is come out fairly quickly with a readable pamphlet, which deals with a couple of issues. One is the WTO consistency. There are arguments for its consistency, but they have to be explained in plain language. Secondly, the possibility of retaliation, and what is the realistic chance of retaliation by China, by Europe, by other countries if we take this into effect? I mean, do we slide into a trade war that we didn't really want, or is the retaliation possibly very low? And the retaliation, there are two main forms that it could take, probably a very large number of forms, but one is countervailing duties against U.S. exports, and the other would be a mirror image non-deduction of U.S. exports to business in destination countries, which was predicated on the U.S. non-deducting imports from that country in its business tax system. In other words, a reciprocal or mirror image possibility. I think those are two realistic things. They have to be thought about as we go forward.
Okay, hang on a minute. Does everyone want to comment on that? Okay, Will,
I
do
just-
you? Okay, let's start with Will and then down the table.
Okay.
Look, I mean, I think it's important to realize that there are two
Press your button.
big tax. There's two big tax proposals on the table. There's Trump's and there's Ryan's, and they're not the same. Trump thinks Ryan's border tax adjustment, or he thought it was very complicated. And what he wants to do is get rates down dramatically. But you know, who knows? I'm not a Republican. Maybe they'll find a way to reconcile these differences and do something about it. But I want to back up to the previous discussion because I think it's relevant here. You know, Trump is doing exactly what he said he was going to do, okay? And his top trade targets were Mexico and China. So you're going to go after them first. Now, the question is, what is he thinking? I mean, you know, he says that NAFTA is the worst trade agreement ever written in human history. TPP is the worst one. The Iran agreement's the worst agreement. They can't all be the worst, but in any case, he never quite says why. What is it that really bugs him about it? It's just that it's the worst. Wilbur Ross has been more precise, and he's targeted the VAT, the tax deductibility of Mexican exports to the United States, and and the opposite going from U.S. exports to Mexico. So that suggests that the Republicans could be drawn to a border adjustment tax or some VAT disguised by some other name, as a kind of as a trade measure, that is to even the playing field with Mexico. But clearly he's looking at he or Wilbur Ross are looking at the tax issue as the way in which countries like Mexico get a competitive advantage over the United States.
Well, yeah, I will say this. If you look at Japan, well, I think NAFTAs will be locked down. So I'll look, and well, you cover it very well. So I look at additional 3 entities: Japan, China, and Europe. What will they do? For Japan, it's not a big issue per se necessarily. The reason being, it's not an export-led country. They're running a trade deficit. They're actually in the same seat as United States. It's very hard to believe, but their trade dependency is actually on par with United States. If you look at export per GDP, Japan is not an export-led country. It's an import-led and investment-driven country, and therefore a destination principle may not be a major issue. Their issue is mainly about breaking the trading system as it looks. And for China, they have capital controls, and they have an 8+% growth. They will still have investment in China. American companies is going to continue to invest in China and keep their profits in China as long as United States cannot deliver 8% growth. So simple. So it comes down to Europe. What will Europe do? Well, WTO dispute is not given for a number of reasons. We don't like to talk about taxation as a trade issue. And also, I should add that we have our own problems with base erosion. This is the reason why we go after the internet platforms in Silicon Valley, because we face the base erosion ourselves. So I would say I'll be tempted to follow actually Gary and say, well, we'll probably do a number of CVDs. It will be the biggest CVDs we have, but we have to put up with something in order to basically try to keep the line along the WTO system and the open system we've had. And there's also a certain element of, well, if they want to shoot themselves in the foot, let them go ahead. And so, but the key problem with Europe is that we can't go to destination principle. Germany has half their GDP coming from export. What are you going to do? Cut off 80% of the corporate tax base? No, you can't do that. It's the same thing with France. 27% of the GDP comes from exports. No, it just can't be done. It's like saying, Europe, you can't continue taxing corporation, and that's exactly what you don't want us to do either. So in that sense, China having the capital controls, and we can't put them up, there has to be some kind of a reaction.
Terry, in a few minutes, a minute.
Thank you. There's 178 countries as of 2013 that had indirect value-added tax systems around the world. Europe's go from, I think, 15 to 27%. And the United States and Saudi Arabia are the only 2 major countries that don't. The U.S. has tried since the 1960s to change the discrimination that our income-based system has faced without success. And so I applaud the House for coming up with a concept. Whether or not it's WTO consistent, I think, is to be found. And I would find it to be quite remarkable, but not unexpected, that our friends in Europe would bring CVD cases when, in fact, the combination of tariffs and VATs in Europe today are comparable to what they were at the end of World War II. Their tariffs have gone down, their VATs have gone up. U.S. exports face basically the same barriers to entry that they did back after the World War II.
Fascinating.
Is this on? Yeah. I don't want to get involved in the tax part. Just to make this political point, clearly the House Republicans, Speaker Ryan, and if you listen to Brady again and again, have put this forward in part. I'm not suggesting they don't want genuine tax reform, but a part of this is an attempt to deflect Trump from the kind of unilateral actions that he's threatening, the 30% tariffs. It will not work. In the first place, the Trump administration is going forward now with actions. And the second place is that this is going to take a while. The Congress is not going to get its act together for months. We haven't even heard from the Senate yet. And Hatch has said, given some reservations. So my point is that at least one part of the Republican leadership theory that they could deflect the Trump administration from the disastrous in its private view effect of these unilateral actions is just not going to work. We're going to see this one way or the other. Now, I don't know that doesn't mean I'm predicting what they're going to do, but you're not going to deflect them from doing what they're going to do unilaterally by this tax debate.
Very
In fact,
interesting
we'll have
insight.
something, on the tax thing that would help there.
Thank you. Gary, it's up to you.
What? I thought you were going to call the time at 1:30.
You're at the time. You're keeping the time right now. You got it.
Well, no, I mean, the points made by others are totally relevant. There is this sense of unfairness that Terry has flagged for really decades. I was in the Treasury Department when the leading cases came up, the Steele case and the Zenith case and so forth. And, we tried to do something to amend our tax system. We had the DISC, we had the Foreign Sales Corporation in Europe, shot it down both times, and I think payback is now coming with this talk about the border tax adjustment. Now, when I was in the Treasury, that's a long time ago, people used to say, well, the exchange rate will take care of the problem. Exchange rate, it'll adjust. Well, we've had 40 years now, and the exchange rate hasn't adjusted. So you don't hear many people saying that the answer is going to be the exchange rate to our trade deficits and so forth. So we're going to come back to this BTA type of concept, and I just hope that in the battle over the BTA, because the business community is really lining up for and against in a very strong way, there'll be tremendous pitches in the papers, both pro and against. But I hope in this battle we don't lose sight of the two really important things. One, get our rates down, and two, go to a territorial system. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Gosh, what a wonderful panel. Thank you so much. I wish the way were clearer. Each one of us has got some ideas about that, but so complex and so fascinating in its complexity. So thank you, and please join me in thanking this really terrific panel.